The forest had fallen silent in a way that made Obergefreiter Klaus Bergmann's skin crawl. It was November 14, 1944, and the dense woodlands near Hürtgen had become a killing ground unlike anything the 26-year-old infantryman had experienced in 3 years of combat. He had survived the brutal winters of the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped so low that machine guns froze solid and men died in their sleep. He had endured the relentless artillery barrages in the Ukraine, where Soviet Katyusha rockets turned entire hillsides into moonscapes of cratered earth. But nothing in his extensive combat experience had prepared him for what was about to rain down from the gray November sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Klaus crouched in a hastily dug foxhole alongside his squad mate, Gefreiter Otto Zimmermann, a farm boy from Brandenburg who still carried photographs of his family's dairy cows in his breast pocket. The Americans had been probing their defensive positions for 3 days, testing the German lines with small arms fire and occasional mortar rounds. Standard procedure. Nothing that suggested the fundamental shift in warfare that was about to unfold. The Wehrmacht soldiers had grown accustomed to the rhythm of American attacks, the predictable patterns of artillery followed by infantry advances. They had developed tactics to counter these methods, learned to read the signs of an impending assault, mastered the art of survival in this grinding war of attrition. Then came the whistling sound that every soldier dreads, the high-pitched scream of incoming mortar rounds arcing through the cold autumn air. Klaus and Otto instinctively pressed themselves against the muddy walls of their foxhole, covering their heads with their arms in the universal gesture of soldiers seeking protection from explosive death. But when the rounds impacted, something was different. Instead of the sharp crack of high explosive detonations followed by the whine of shrapnel, there was a softer bursting sound, almost gentle, followed immediately by an intense white brilliance that seemed to ignite the very air itself. Klaus lifted his head cautiously and witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Approximately 50 meters to his left, where Unteroffizier Hans Richter's squad had been positioned, white flames were spreading with impossible speed. But these were not ordinary flames. They burned with an intensity that seemed unnatural, a phosphorescent white fire that clung to everything it touched and could not be extinguished. Trees exploded into torches within seconds. The ground itself appeared to be burning. And the screaming was unlike anything Klaus had ever heard, even on the Eastern Front where he had witnessed horrors beyond description. Men emerged from their positions engulfed in flames that water could not quench. Hans Richter, a veteran sergeant who had survived campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, staggered into view completely covered in burning white substance. He was tearing at his uniform, trying desperately to remove the material, but the flames only spread to his hands, his face, his exposed skin. Other soldiers attempted to help him, beating at the flames with their hands and jackets, but the white fire transferred to them as well, spreading like a living thing that sought out flesh and consumed it with terrible efficiency. Otto Zimmermann vomited into the bottom of their foxhole, the acrid smell mixing with the strange chemical odor that now permeated the air. Klaus wanted to look away, but found himself transfixed by the nightmare unfolding before him. This was something new, something the German army had not encountered before, something their training manuals and combat experience had not prepared them for. The white phosphorus rounds continued to fall, systematically covering their defensive sector with this hellish substance that burned at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius and could not be smothered by conventional means. The German defensive positions in the Hürtgen forest had been carefully prepared over several weeks. Feldwebel Werner Koch, the platoon sergeant responsible for this sector, had personally supervised the construction of interlocking fields of fire, reinforced bunkers, and communication trenches designed to withstand sustained American artillery bombardment. Werner was 34 years old, a professional soldier who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1936 and had risen through the ranks based on competence and battlefield performance rather than political connections. He took pride in his work and in the men under his command, most of whom were young conscripts who looked to him for guidance and leadership in the chaos of combat. The forest itself provided natural advantages for defense. The dense evergreen trees limited visibility and made coordinated attacks difficult. The rough terrain channeled advancing forces into predictable routes that could be covered by machine gun fire. The Germans had mined the approaches extensively and had established observation posts that provided early warning of American movements. By every measure of conventional military doctrine, their position was strong. Werner had fought in enough campaigns to recognize a defensible position when he saw one, and he had assured his company commander that this sector could hold against numerically superior forces for an extended period. The Americans had begun their assault on November 11th with a preparatory artillery barrage that lasted 40 minutes. Werner and his men had weathered this bombardment in their reinforced positions, emerging afterward to repel the initial infantry probes with practiced efficiency. The pattern repeated on November 12th and 13th, artillery followed by infantry attacks that were beaten back with casualties on both sides, but no significant penetration of the German line. Werner had seen this pattern countless times before. It was the standard American approach, relying on superior firepower and material abundance to gradually wear down defensive positions. What Werner and his men did not know was that the American forces facing them had received a new weapon, one specifically designed to address the tactical challenges posed by fortified forest positions. White phosphorus mortar rounds had been used sporadically earlier in the war, primarily for creating smoke screens and marking targets. But in the autumn of 1944, American forces were beginning to employ them as anti-personnel weapons in situations where conventional high-explosive rounds proved insufficient. The dense forest canopy that provided such excellent protection for German positions also prevented artillery tree bursts from being fully effective. High-explosive rounds would detonate against tree trunks and upper branches, dissipating much of their lethal energy before reaching soldiers in foxholes and bunkers below. White phosphorus offered a solution to this tactical problem. The rounds would burst above or among the trees, scattering burning particles over a wide area. The phosphorus would then ignite spontaneously upon contact with air, creating fires that spread downward through the forest canopy and into the defensive positions below. The substance burned at extremely high temperatures and was nearly impossible to extinguish with available field methods. Water actually accelerated the reaction in many cases, and attempts to smother the flames often resulted in the phosphorus reigniting once exposed to air again. Most significantly, white phosphorus produced thick white smoke that obscured visibility and created panic among troops who had never encountered it before. The American mortar teams that fired the first white phosphorus barrage on November 14th were members of the 4th Infantry Division, veterans of the Normandy landings who had fought their way through France over the preceding months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sergeant Frank Morrison commanded one of the mortar sections positioned approximately 2,000 meters behind the front line. His team operated 3 M2 60mm mortars, weapons light enough to be man-portable but capable of delivering sustained fire support to infantry units engaged in close combat. Frank was 23 years old, a former construction worker from Pennsylvania who had been drafted in 1942 and had received extensive training in indirect fire techniques. On the morning of November 14th, Frank and his team received orders to engage German positions in grid square 7349 using white phosphorus rounds exclusively. This was unusual. Typically, mortar fire missions employed a mixture of high explosive and white phosphorus, with the latter used primarily for adjusting fire and marking targets. An entire fire mission using only white phosphorus suggested that higher command wanted to achieve specific effects beyond simple suppression of enemy positions. Frank had fired white phosphorus rounds before and understood their characteristics. He had seen the results during training exercises and knew that the weapon created impressive visual effects. But he had never used it extensively against occupied defensive positions, and he did not fully comprehend the psychological impact it would have on the soldiers at the receiving end. The fire mission began at 10:15 in the morning. Frank's section alone fired 60 rounds over the course of 20 minutes, systematically walking the barrage across the German defensive sector based on coordinates provided by forward observers. Other mortar sections along the American line were conducting similar missions, creating a coordinated assault that saturated multiple German positions simultaneously. From Frank's position, he could see the white smoke rising above the forest canopy 2 kilometers away, dense clouds that obscured entire sections of the battlefield. He could hear the muted crump of rounds detonating among the trees, a sound distinctly different from the sharp crack of high explosive impacts. What he could not see or hear were the effects his fire was producing on the German soldiers caught in the target area. Klaus Bergmann remained frozen in his foxhole as the barrage continued. The initial shock had given way to a different kind of terror, the realization that conventional responses to artillery fire were inadequate against this new threat. Normally, soldiers would remain in their protected positions during a barrage, trusting their overhead cover and the depth of their foxholes to shield them from shrapnel and blast effects. But white phosphorus was different. It did not rely on explosive force or metal fragments. It worked through fire and smoke, elements that flowed like liquid into any space not completely sealed. The burning particles drifted down through the forest canopy like a deadly snowfall, landing on exposed equipment, touching off fires in the leaf litter and fallen branches that carpeted the forest floor, seeking out any flesh or fabric they could ignite. Otto Zimmermann was hyperventilating, his breath coming in rapid gasps that threatened to become full panic. Klaus grabbed his shoulder, squeezing hard to focus his attention. They needed to move, to escape from this zone of burning death, but leaving their foxhole during an active barrage violated every instinct and training they possessed. Yet staying meant potentially being burned alive as the phosphorus accumulated around and above them. Klaus made the decision that probably saved both their lives. He ordered Otto to follow him, and they abandoned their carefully prepared position, crawling on their bellies through the underbrush toward a communication trench that led to the rear. The journey covered less than 80 meters, but felt like kilometers. Burning particles fell around them, landing on their uniforms and equipment. Klaus felt a piece land on the back of his hand, a sensation like touching a red-hot iron. He scraped it off with his rifle butt, watching in horrified fascination as the phosphorus continued to burn where it fell, eating through the dead leaves and into the soil beneath. They passed other soldiers attempting similar escapes, men whose eyes were wide with terror that transcended anything combat had previously inflicted upon them. Some were wounded, their uniforms smoldering where phosphorus had touched them. Others were simply fleeing in blind panic, all training and discipline momentarily overwhelmed by this unprecedented horror. Werner Koch was attempting to maintain control of his platoon as the barrage transformed his carefully prepared defensive sector into an inferno. His command post, a reinforced bunker with overhead log cover, was filling with smoke as burning phosphorus accumulated on and around the structure. The radio operator was reporting that communication trenches to adjacent units were blocked by fires, effectively isolating Werner's position from the rest of the company. Casualty reports were fragmentary and confused, but it was clear that multiple squads had been caught in the open or in inadequately covered positions when the barrage began. The screaming had diminished somewhat, replaced by an eerie crackling sound as fires consumed everything combustible in the impact zone. Werner faced an impossible decision. Military doctrine dictated that defensive positions must be held regardless of casualties. Abandoning prepared positions under fire was one of the gravest military sins, likely to result in court-martial if survivors were identified and charged. But the alternative was watching his entire platoon die in a manner that served no tactical purpose. The American infantry had not yet launched an assault. The white phosphorus barrage appeared designed purely to inflict casualties and destroy the defensive position itself, rendering it uninhabitable even if the Germans managed to survive the bombardment. Werner had commanded men through terrible situations before, but he had always been able to offer them some hope of survival through proper tactics and discipline. This situation offered neither. The decision was ultimately made for him when the bunker's log roof caught fire. The smoke inside became so thick that breathing was impossible. Werner ordered evacuation, and his remaining men stumbled out into the nightmare landscape that their defensive sector had become. Trees stood like burning pillars, their bark blackened and peeling. The ground was covered with spots of intense white flame that marked where phosphorus particles continued to burn. The air itself seemed hostile, thick with smoke and chemical fumes that seared the lungs and caused eyes to water uncontrollably. Werner led his men toward the rear, moving through pre-planned evacuation routes that were now obstacle courses of burning vegetation and unstable terrain. They encountered Klaus and Otto emerging from the communication trench, both men filthy and shaken but functional. Werner quickly organized the survivors into a coherent unit, counting heads and assessing casualties as best he could in the chaos. Of his original platoon strength of 42 men, he could account for only 27. The others were dead, wounded, or separated in the confusion.
More critically, his defensive sector no longer existed as a meaningful military position. The bunkers were burning or smoke-filled, the foxholes were death traps, and the fields of fire were obscured by dense smoke that showed no signs of clearing. When American infantry finally advanced an hour later, they encountered only sporadic resistance from disorganized German survivors before occupying positions that had cost weeks of labor to construct. The experience of Werner's platoon was replicated across multiple sectors of the Hürtgen forest that day and in subsequent days, as American forces increasingly employed white phosphorus as a tactical weapon. German after-action reports began documenting a new phenomenon: entire units rendered combat ineffective not through conventional attrition, but through psychological breakdown caused by exposure to this terrible weapon. Soldiers who had endured years of combat on multiple fronts were reduced to quivering wrecks by 30 minutes of white phosphorus bombardment. The weapon's effects transcended physical casualties, creating a climate of fear that eroded unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness in ways that conventional artillery could not achieve. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner commanded the company to which Werner's platoon belonged. Friedrich was 41 years old, a career officer who had commanded troops in Poland, France, and Russia before being posted to the Western Front in September 1944. He had extensive experience with artillery and had developed sophisticated defensive tactics designed to minimize casualties from American firepower superiority. But white phosphorus represented something fundamentally different from the weapons he had encountered previously. The reports reaching his command post painted a picture of devastation that seemed disproportionate to the actual tonnage of explosives employed. Entire platoons were reporting themselves combat ineffective after relatively brief bombardments. Casualty figures were difficult to establish because many soldiers had simply fled their positions and were scattered throughout the rear areas in varying states of psychological distress. Friedrich's assessment of the situation was complicated by the fact that higher headquarters seemed unprepared to acknowledge the psychological impact of this new weapon. Division intelligence reports focused on technical specifications and tactical applications, treating white phosphorus as simply another form of artillery ammunition with different characteristics. But Friedrich's company was experiencing effects that went far beyond technical parameters. Soldiers who had functioned effectively for months were exhibiting symptoms that resembled shell shock, but accelerated and intensified beyond anything documented in medical literature. Men who had witnessed friends torn apart by high explosive shells were now rendered catatonic by exposure to burning phosphorus. The medical aspects of white phosphorus casualties were equally unprecedented. Lieutenant Dr. Ernst Hoffmann had served as company medic for 18 months, treating everything from simple gunshot wounds to severe burns from flamethrower attacks. But white phosphorus injuries defied his medical training and available treatments. The burns were unlike anything in his experience, penetrating deeply into tissue and continuing to cause damage long after the initial exposure. Conventional burn treatments were not only ineffective but often counterproductive. Water could cause phosphorus embedded in tissue to reignite. Attempts to remove particles surgically often resulted in further exposure for both patient and medic. Ernst's first white phosphorus casualty arrived at his aid station on November 15th, the day after Werner's platoon had been decimated. Gefreiter Hans Kruger had been caught in the open during another barrage and had suffered burns across 20% of his body. The wounds were unlike conventional burns in several disturbing ways. They continued to smoke and emit chemical odors hours after the initial injury. The tissue damage extended deeper than surface burns typically did, affecting muscle and bone in some areas. Most disturbingly, portions of the phosphorus remained embedded in the tissue, invisible to visual inspection, but capable of spontaneous reignition if exposed to air during treatment. Ernst worked through the night attempting to treat Hans and 2 other white phosphorus casualties. His medical supplies, adequate for treating conventional combat injuries, proved wholly insufficient for these cases. Morphine provided limited pain relief for wounds that seemed to generate pain through chemical action rather than simple tissue damage. Bandaging was complicated by the possibility of embedded phosphorus particles igniting gauze or cotton dressings. The normal procedures for cleaning and disinfecting wounds could not be safely applied when phosphorus contamination was suspected. By dawn, Ernst had developed improvised treatment protocols based on educated guesswork, but all 3 patients remained in critical condition with little prospect of recovery using field medical techniques. The psychological impact on Ernst himself was significant. He had maintained clinical detachment through months of treating horrific wounds, developing the emotional armor necessary for military medical work. But white phosphorus cases challenged this professional distance in ways that conventional trauma did not. The continuing nature of the injuries, the way they defied treatment, the obvious suffering they caused, all contributed to a sense of helplessness that eroded Ernst's confidence in his ability to help wounded men. When he finally managed to evacuate the 3 casualties to a field hospital 10 kilometers behind the lines, he learned that medical personnel there were equally unprepared to deal with white phosphorus injuries. Reports from other sectors of the Hürtgen forest painted a similar picture of medical confusion and inadequate treatment protocols. White phosphorus was creating casualties that required specialized knowledge and equipment that simply did not exist at the forward medical facilities. The standard evacuation chain that efficiently processed conventional battle casualties became bottlenecked when confronted with injuries that required immediate specialized attention but could not be safely transported using normal procedures. Ambulance crews reported incidents where phosphorus-contaminated patients had caused secondary fires in medical vehicles. Field hospitals began refusing white phosphorus casualties until specialized handling procedures could be established. The broader implications of this medical crisis were becoming apparent to senior German commanders. General der Infanterie Friedrich Kochling, commanding the LXI Corps responsible for this sector of the Hürtgen forest, received reports from multiple divisions describing similar patterns of casualties and unit degradation. The Americans appeared to be employing white phosphorus systematically across the entire front, not as an experimental weapon, but a standard tactical procedure. German defensive doctrine, developed through 4 years of combat experience, was proving inadequate against this new threat. Units were abandoning carefully prepared positions not due to tactical defeat, but because those positions had become uninhabitable. Friedrich Kochling was 57 years old, a veteran of the First World War who had commanded troops at every level from company to corps during the current conflict. He had developed a reputation for innovative defensive tactics and had successfully held difficult positions against numerically superior forces on multiple occasions. But the reports reaching his headquarters in November 1944 described a fundamentally different kind of warfare. The Americans were not trying to capture German positions through conventional assault. They were making those positions untenable through the systematic application of a weapon that created casualties, destroyed morale, and rendered defensive works unusable without requiring infantry attack. The intelligence reports that Friedrich received painted a disturbing picture of American material capabilities. White phosphorus ammunition was being employed not sparingly as a special weapon reserved for specific tactical situations, but routinely, suggesting that American forces possessed sufficient quantities to use it as standard procedure.
This implied a level of chemical production and logistical capability that exceeded German estimates of American industrial capacity. If the Americans could mass produce and distribute exotic ammunition types to frontline units, what other capabilities might they possess that German intelligence had failed to identify? Oberst Wilhelm Bremer commanded the 344th Infantry Division, one of 3 divisions under Friedrich's Corps that had experienced sustained white phosphorus attacks during November 1944. Wilhelm was responsible for a 12-kilometer section of the Hürtgen forest defenses, positions that had been fortified over 2 months of intensive labor. His division had lost over 30% of its effective strength in 10 days, not primarily through direct combat casualties, but through psychological breakdown and abandonment of positions rendered untenable by phosphorus bombardment. The tactical implications were catastrophic. German defensive strategy depended on holding prepared positions long enough to inflict casualties on attacking forces and delay American advances. But white phosphorus allowed American forces to neutralize defensive positions without exposing their own infantry to significant risk. Wilhelm's analysis of the tactical situation was grim. German forces could not remain in positions subjected to sustained white phosphorus bombardment. But withdrawing from prepared defenses meant exposing troops to American firepower superiority in open terrain where German tactical advantages were minimized. The Americans had essentially created a tactical dilemma with no satisfying solution. German forces could stay and be burned out of their positions, or withdraw and be destroyed by conventional weapons in terrain that favored the attackers. Either choice resulted in tactical defeat, but the psychological impact of white phosphorus made the first option increasingly untenable, as soldiers simply refused to remain in positions where they might be subjected to this form of attack. The American forces employing white phosphorus were experiencing their own learning curve regarding the weapon's effects and optimal employment techniques. Major Robert Hayes commanded the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, one of the units tasked with advancing through German positions that had been subjected to white phosphorus bombardment. Robert was 31 years old, a career officer who had led the same battalion through the Normandy campaign and the subsequent advance across France. He had extensive experience with coordinating infantry assaults following artillery preparation, but white phosphorus created battlefield conditions unlike anything in his previous experience. The first difference Robert noticed was the persistence of the weapon's effects. Conventional artillery preparation would suppress enemy positions for the duration of the bombardment and perhaps 15 minutes afterward, allowing attacking infantry to close with defensive positions before defenders could fully recover. White phosphorus created effects that lasted for hours. Positions that had been bombarded in the morning were still burning and smoking in the afternoon, effectively denying their use to either side. This persistence offered tactical advantages, but also created obstacles for American forces attempting to occupy cleared ground. Robert's battalion encountered these obstacles during their advance on November 16th, 2 days after the initial white phosphorus bombardment of Werner's sector. The forest through which they advanced was a moonscape of burning trees, smoke-filled clearings, and smoldering defensive positions. Visibility was limited to 10 or 15 meters in many areas due to persistent smoke. The air was thick with chemical fumes that caused respiratory irritation even among American troops equipped with gas masks. Most significantly, many of the German defensive positions that were the objectives of the attack had been destroyed or rendered unusable by the very weapon intended to clear them. The psychological effects on American troops were also becoming apparent. While they had not been subjected to white phosphorus attack themselves, advancing through areas where it had been employed created its own form of stress. Soldiers reported feeling nauseous by the chemical odors and disturbed by evidence of the weapon's effects on enemy personnel. Bodies recovered from German positions showed signs of death by burning that were more extreme than anything most American soldiers had previously encountered.
The visual evidence of white phosphorus casualties challenged the traditional military distinction between legitimate weapons of war and instruments of unnecessary cruelty. Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell commanded one of the rifle squads in Roberts' battalion. Thomas was 26 years old, a former mechanic from Michigan who had been drafted in 1942 and had served with the same unit since basic training. He had participated in 5 major campaigns and had developed the emotional detachment necessary for infantry combat. But advancing through white phosphorus impact areas created psychological pressures that differed from conventional battle stress. The evidence of suffering was more extreme and more persistent than typical combat casualties. Bodies were burned beyond recognition. Equipment was melted or fused together by extreme heat. The landscape itself appeared poisoned, with vegetation killed or dying over large areas. Thomas's squad was tasked with clearing German bunkers that had survived the bombardment. Most were empty, their occupants having fled during or immediately after the attack. But some contained German soldiers who had been overcome by smoke or who had been too severely injured to evacuate. These encounters were psychologically challenging for American troops who had been trained to view enemy soldiers as dangerous opponents, but who were now confronting men reduced to victims of chemical warfare. The normal dynamics of infantry combat, where enemy soldiers were active threats to be neutralized, were replaced by scenes that resembled the aftermath of industrial accidents more than military action. The tactical effectiveness of white phosphorus was undeniable from an American perspective. German defensive positions that had resisted conventional artillery for days were abandoned within hours of phosphorus bombardment. American casualty rates dropped significantly as German units withdrew from prepared positions rather than endure repeated chemical attacks. The tempo of the American advance increased as resistance diminished. But the weapon's effects created operational complications that had not been anticipated by higher commanders who viewed white phosphorus primarily a technical solution to the tactical problem of fortified forest positions. Colonel James Patterson commanded the artillery regiment responsible for providing fire support to Roberts' battalion and several other infantry units operating in the Hürtgen forest. James was 38 years old, a regular Army officer who had commanded artillery units in North Africa and Italy before being transferred to Northwest Europe. He had extensive experience coordinating indirect fire support for infantry operations and understood the technical capabilities and limitations of various ammunition types. But white phosphorus presented unique challenges that fell outside conventional artillery doctrine. The logistical requirements for sustained white phosphorus bombardment were significant. The rounds were more expensive to manufacture than conventional high-explosive ammunition and required special handling procedures due to their chemical properties. Transportation and storage involved additional safety considerations that complicated supply operations. Most significantly, the tactical effects of white phosphorus were difficult to predict and control. Unlike high-explosive rounds, whose effects could be calculated based on well-understood ballistic and explosive principles, white phosphorus created effects that varied dramatically based on weather conditions, terrain features, and target characteristics.
James found himself managing fire missions that produced results far exceeding their intended scope. A routine fire mission designed to suppress a specific German strongpoint would often result in fires that spread far beyond the target area, creating obstacles for subsequent American operations. Weather conditions played a crucial role in determining effectiveness, with wind patterns spreading burning particles in unpredictable directions. Forest fires initiated by white phosphorus could burn for days, creating smoke screens that impaired visibility for both sides and generating toxic fumes that posed health risks to American personnel. These operational complications were reported up the chain of command to division and corps headquarters, where planners were attempting to integrate white phosphorus into broader tactical doctrine. The weapon's effectiveness in neutralizing German defensive positions was clear, but its side effects were creating unforeseen challenges for American operations. Higher commanders found themselves balancing the tactical advantages of a highly effective weapon against operational complications that reduced overall efficiency and created additional risks for American forces.
Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison served as the chemical warfare officer for the 1st Infantry Division, responsible for coordinating the employment of specialized ammunition types, including white phosphorus. David was 33 years old, a chemist in civilian life who had been commissioned as a specialist officer when the war began. His technical background gave him insights into the chemical properties and tactical applications of white phosphorus that most line officers lacked. But his position also made him aware of aspects of the weapons employment that were not being adequately addressed in operational planning. The most significant concern that David identified was the persistent contamination of terrain subjected to white phosphorus bombardment. Unlike conventional explosives, which created localized damage that could be quickly cleared and repaired, white phosphorus contaminated soil and vegetation with chemical residues that remained dangerous for extended periods. Areas that had been bombarded with white phosphorus continued to pose risks to personnel weeks after the initial attack. Rain could cause buried phosphorus particles to resurface and reignite. Excavation work could expose personnel to chemical burns from contaminated soil. These contamination issues had implications that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. Terrain that had been subjected to white phosphorus bombardment would remain hazardous for civilian populations returning after hostilities ended. Agricultural areas would be rendered unusable for crop production until contaminated soil could be identified and remediated. Water sources could be polluted by runoff from contaminated areas. The long-term environmental effects of widespread white phosphorus employment were unknown but potentially significant. David's reports to higher headquarters raised these concerns but received limited attention from commanders focused on immediate tactical requirements. The pressure to maintain offensive momentum and minimize American casualties created incentives to employ the most effective weapons available without extensive consideration of secondary effects. White phosphorus was demonstrably effective in neutralizing German defensive positions and reducing American casualties during assault operations. These immediate tactical benefits outweighed abstract concerns about long-term environmental contamination or the ethical implications of chemical warfare. The German response to sustained white phosphorus employment evolved over several weeks as commanders developed new tactical approaches designed to minimize the weapon's effectiveness. General Friedrich Koechling issued new defensive guidelines that emphasized mobility and dispersion rather than the construction of fixed positions that could be targeted by chemical bombardment. German units were instructed to avoid concentrating in areas that provided good targets for indirect fire and to maintain the capability for rapid displacement when subjected to chemical attack. These tactical adaptations had limited effectiveness against a weapon whose primary mechanism was area denial rather than precision targeting. White phosphorus created effects over large areas that could not be avoided through tactical movement within the confines of prepared defensive sectors. German units attempting to implement mobile defense tactics found themselves operating in terrain that had been systematically contaminated by previous bombardments, limiting their freedom of movement and creating persistent health hazards for personnel operating in affected areas. Oberst Hans Weber commanded a regiment that had been repeatedly subjected to white phosphorus attack during December 1944. Hans was 43 years old, a career officer who had commanded troops at various levels throughout the war. His regiment had initially occupied a strong defensive position anchored on concrete bunkers and extensive field fortifications. After 2 weeks of intermittent white phosphorus bombardment, his command was reduced to a mobile force that avoided fixed positions and conducted a fighting withdrawal through terrain that had become largely uninhabitable due to chemical contamination. The transformation of Hans's regiment illustrated the broader impact of white phosphorus on German defensive capabilities. Units that had been trained and equipped for positional warfare were forced to adopt tactics for which they were poorly prepared and inadequately equipped. German logistics systems, already strained by material shortages and transportation difficulties, could not support the increased supply requirements of mobile operations. Command and control systems designed for static defense became ineffective when units were forced to operate as dispersed, mobile forces without fixed communication facilities. The psychological impact on German personnel continued to escalate as white phosphorus employment became routine rather than exceptional. Soldiers who had adapted to the stress of conventional combat found themselves unable to cope with the prospect of chemical attack. Unit cohesion deteriorated as men refused orders that would expose them to white phosphorus bombardment. Disciplinary problems increased as traditional military authority structures proved inadequate for maintaining control over troops subjected to this form of warfare. Medical facilities throughout the German rear areas were overwhelmed by white phosphorus casualties whose treatment requirements exceeded available capability. The evacuation system, designed to handle conventional battle casualties efficiently, became bottlenecked by cases that required specialized treatment and extended hospitalization. Medical personnel, already operating under severe resource constraints, found themselves unable to provide effective treatment for injuries that fell outside their training and experience. By January 1945, German commanders at all levels were reporting that white phosphorus had fundamentally altered the tactical balance in the Hürtgen forest and similar heavily forested terrain where the weapon was being employed extensively. Defensive positions that should have been tenable for weeks were being abandoned within hours of the first chemical bombardment. Units were suffering casualty rates that exceeded combat losses as soldiers were evacuated for psychological breakdown, chemical burns, and respiratory injuries caused by exposure to contaminated areas. The broader strategic implications were becoming apparent to senior German leadership. If American forces possessed sufficient quantities of white phosphorus to employ it routinely across multiple sectors, and if German forces could not develop effective countermeasures, then the tactical foundations of German defensive strategy were fundamentally compromised. The ability to hold fortified positions long enough to inflict significant casualties on attacking forces was the cornerstone of German defensive doctrine. White phosphorus threatened to eliminate this tactical advantage entirely, forcing German forces into mobile operations for which they were increasingly ill-equipped as material shortages and personnel losses mounted. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.